Alright guys, today we come with another video, so let's start.
It is August 6th, 1945. In Hiroshima, the sky is a brilliant blue. By 8 in the morning, the city is wide awake. Children sit for their first period of school, and commuters pour into their offices. Then, high above the streets, an American B-29 bomber comes into view. Something slips from its bay doors. For exactly 43 seconds, it is in free fall. The resulting fireball reaches 4,000 degrees Celsius. In an instant, 80,000 people are killed. The flash is so intense that the only trace left of some commuters are their shadows, permanently baked into the stone pavements. Halfway across the world in Washington, D.C., President Harry Truman sits at his desk. To the American military command, the vaporization of an entire city is not viewed as a tragedy. It is a strategic triumph. To understand how the deliberate destruction of civilians became a mathematically acceptable military strategy, we have to look at the cold logic of global resource management that started this conflict in the first place. Back in the early 20th century, Japan was rapidly expanding. The government sought to build a united Greater Asia, which was effectively a campaign to colonize neighboring territories and siphon off their raw materials to feed a growing empire. When Japanese forces violently pushed into French Indochina, the United States decided to intervene. They froze Japanese economic assets and halted all exports of essential metals like iron and copper. This animated graph shows the immediate catastrophic drop in Japan's oil imports. The U.S. supplied 80% of Japan's oil, and they cut that number to zero. America demanded that Japan withdraw from its occupied Chinese territories if they ever wanted to see another barrel. But squeezing a rapidly industrializing empire cornered them. Japan's leadership faced a stark binary choice: abandon their imperial ambitions to satisfy the American demands, or secure a new oil supply through force. The nearest viable oil fields were under British and Dutch control in Southeast Asia. Attacking them meant fighting America's allies, which would draw the U.S. military into the conflict regardless. So Japan's strategists made a massive gamble: launch a preemptive strike to cripple the American fleet, buying enough time to seize the southern oil fields. On December 7, 1941, over 350 Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack killed over 2,000 military personnel and dealt a devastating blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Days later, Germany and Italy honored their alliances with Japan and declared war on the United States, pulling the entire globe into a total, inescapable conflict. Japan had hoped a sudden, violent shock would keep America out of the Pacific. Instead, their attack activated a sprawling industrial and military engine that would relentlessly push them back to their home islands. By 1945, the Axis powers in Europe had collapsed, but Japan refused to yield. The Japanese public had been heavily conditioned to revere Emperor Hirohito as a living deity. Surrendering was framed as a supreme spiritual humiliation, far worse than death. This conditioning manifested on the battlefield. During the Battle of Okinawa, American forces faced relentless kamikaze suicide attacks and soldiers fighting to the last man. By the time the island was taken, over 100,000 local civilians had died in the crossfire. This graphic illustrates the math of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. Military planners looked at the fanaticism on Okinawa and calculated that a full-scale invasion could drag on for 10 years, weighing down the scales with an estimated 1 million American casualties. But Truman had been briefed on another variable. Deep in the New Mexico desert, scientists had successfully detonated the world's first atomic bomb. The president was suddenly faced with a horrific trolley problem: balancing 1 million projected American casualties against the immediate deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens. To the military commanders in Washington, the math was clear. Wiping a city off the map was an acceptable cost to spare an American invasion force. In July 1945, Allied leaders met to issue the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The Japanese government, desperate to protect the political survival of their emperor, rejected the ultimatum. In response, Truman authorized the deployment of a weapon ironically named Little Boy. The target was Hiroshima, the city where 95% of the population were non-combatants. The aftermath was a biological nightmare. Survivors suffered through black, toxic rain and flesh peeling from their bones. 90% of the city's doctors and nurses were killed in the initial blast, leaving the dying with absolutely no one to help them. The Allied leaders had promised prompt and utter destruction on paper. On the ground, that sterile diplomatic phrasing translated to a grotesque, agonizing end for tens of thousands of ordinary people simply walking to work. Yet the atomic bomb wasn't the only pressure point that forced Japan's hand. Just hours before the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, the Soviet Union formally declared war, sending a massive tank convoy pouring over the hills into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Facing complete annihilation from nuclear strikes above and a relentless Soviet advance on the ground, the Japanese Supreme Council was deadlocked at 3-3. Ultimately, Emperor Hirohito intervened, breaking the tie and agreeing to the surrender that ended the Second World War. President Truman never apologized for the bombings. He maintained for the rest of his life that utilizing the weapon was a blessing, a brutal but necessary strike that ended the conflict and saved millions of lives on both sides. We can debate whether the desperate military math of 1945 justified targeting civilians, but the shadows baked into the stone of Hiroshima leave us with a permanent mandate. The calculus of nuclear warfare must never be tested again.